Cassie here, welcome back to my channel, and today we are doing the Writers Are Weird tag. We are indeed, and this tag was created by Elliot Brooks. There are 10 questions, and her original video is linked down below if you want to check that out. But without further ado, let's get into the questions. Question number 1, do you have any bizarre internet searches? And if so, what's the weirdest one? I was trying to think about my answer to this question, and honestly, I don't really think I do have a lot of weird ones. I feel like my stories aren't, like, a lot of times people talk about Googling, like, things about how to murder people or whatever, and I just don't write stories like that. Like, the two books I've already written are contemporary, like, romance with some murder, but not really anything I needed to Google, I guess. So I don't know. I mean, I think the weirdest thing I ever have done research-wise was going to the library to read through the DSM, which is like a book for psychologists that basically just lists all of the mental illnesses that exist and their classifications and like symptoms and things, because when I was first writing my first book, Keep No Record, I knew that I wanted the main character Jacob to have some sort of mental illness that would sort of explain some of his behaviors, and I knew what his behaviors were, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't just guessing at how he would be diagnosed, basically, if he like walked into a psychologist's office. So I read through that whole book. I mean, I didn't read the whole book, but I looked through every single mental illness in the book and jotted down the ones that sounded kind of like him, and that's how I figured that out. So I think that's kind of the weirdest thing I've done research-wise, but it wasn't a search on the internet. Most of my searches on the internet honestly have been about like locations, like what are some fun things to do in New York City during Christmas time, because in my new book, Broken Together, 2 of the characters are exploring New York at Christmas time, and I've never been to New York, let alone at Christmas, so I had to look some things up. But yeah, nothing really too weird or bizarre, I guess. Question number 2, do you write people you know and dislike into your stories as villains or dumb people to kill off? I don't write people I know into my stories ever. The closest I would say maybe this applies is that I sometimes do take characteristics of people I know. Like, there are certain characters that maybe a certain aspect of that character is like, oh, that's so like this person, and it makes me think of somebody else. But yeah, I don't really like to write people into my books. I just think that's a little weird. So I guess I would say no to that question. But I do take certain characteristics of people. I also take maybe certain situations that have happened to me and write about them as something funny. Like in Broken Together, there's a part where a character mentions that their first kiss was in kindergarten and that they took a boy into a shed or something during recess and kissed him, and he screamed and threatened to tell the teacher. And that is a true story of this girl right here. That was my first kiss. I don't really count it as my first kiss when I think of my first kiss, but technically that's how it went down. So I take little situations like that and maybe put them into the story if they're applicable, but I don't write people I know into my books. That feels weird to me. Question number 3, does personal hygiene sometimes come second to writing? I would say personal hygiene sometimes comes second to a lot of things in my life. That sounds terrible, but it's kind of true. I mean, I work as a housekeeper. Most days of the week, I don't see any people. Or like, if I do, it's like I see a client for a second and then they leave and I clean their house and I'm getting dirty and sweaty anyway. So most days I don't really like get all primped up. I just wake up and put on my work clothes and go to work. And I do take a shower when I get home, but I don't take a shower to like look cute. I just shower because I'm sweaty and gross from working. So yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say necessarily that personal hygiene comes second to writing always, because I'm not, it's hard to say right now because I'm not really in an active period of like drafting a lot right now. But I guess when I am drafting a lot, like especially during NaNoWriMo or something, absolutely personal hygiene just goes out the window because ain't nobody got time for that. Question number 4, do you go on baby name websites to help you name your characters? Yes, I definitely do that. I use the internet in many different ways to help me name my characters, mostly because, well, I do usually just have character names that come to mind and that feel right to me. But the problem is that I am one of those people who tends to always come up with names that start with the same letter. Usually it's A's and J's. I just automatically think of A names a lot and J names a lot. And a good writing tip is that you shouldn't have too many of your characters have very similar sounding names because it gets confusing. So sometimes I have to go to a baby name website just to be like, you know, my 2 main characters are Jacob and Jenna. I can't have the side characters be Joseph and Jessica. Like, I've got to name those side characters something else. So when that situation arises, I definitely use baby name websites. I'm not really someone who cares that much about like the names having meaning. To me, the names just like feel right. Like sometimes a name might mean something that's like, ooh, that's symbolic for the story. But if the name doesn't sound right and doesn't feel like something that character would be named, then I don't like it. Also, another important thing about naming characters is thinking about the fact that their parents named them this. So if you maybe you have like a really hipstery, like modern kind of character, but if their parents are really conservative and traditional, then they wouldn't have named their kid like Xander or some kind of like, you know, more popular modern sounding name. So that's something to take into consideration. Also, something I've heard people critique books for, which personally I think is really nitpicky, and I'm not too worried about it, but I did sort of take it into consideration that this is apparently something some people notice, is whether or not names are appropriate for the region the person comes from. Like, for instance, I don't know, like the book Royals, or now it's called Prince Charming, which is stupid, but whatever. The book Royals by Rachel Hawkins was set in Ireland, I think, or Scotland, I think. And a lot of people, I guess, who read the book and are from that area said that a lot of the names she picked for the characters who were supposed to be from there are just things that people in Scotland would never name their kids. Like, it's extremely uncommon names for that region. So that's something important to think about as well. So I did actually recently look up, I was trying to figure out what last names to give to my characters, and they're from like a small town in Indiana. So I just looked up a town, like a small town in Indiana, and said like, what are some common last names from this place? And I actually found a list of like a legit census of this tiny little town in Indiana, and I picked their last names from that list. Another thing I had to look up recently in regards to naming was one of my characters is very wealthy, so I just Googled like what are some last names that are common among really wealthy people, because that is kind of a thing that happens. You know, wealthy families like continue generationally and continue to be wealthy a lot of the time. So we do kind of see people who are wealthy and have like certain names. Certain names just like make you think wealth, and it's not just because of how it sounds, it's because these people actually exist. And then from that, I decided to name my character Ari Aster, which I love until I just watched the movie Midsummer and discovered that there is a human person who's famous and a director named Ari Aster. So yeah, I'm not gonna change his name because I'm already very attached to it, and it is spelled differently. Both Ari and Aster are spelled differently in my book than he spells them, but it was a little bit like, oh, really? I wouldn't have named him that if I knew that there was some famous director with that exact name. It's just like, that's a little bit, it might be jarring for some people if they're familiar with that director to read that name on the page. So whatever, stupid Ari Aster ruining all my plans. But he makes good movies, so I can't complain too much. Question number 5, do you have a list of actors and actresses who would play your characters if a movie adaptation was made? I don't have a list, but it is something that I think about often if, you know, you're just picturing characters and thinking, oh, who would play this character in a movie? But I don't, honestly, like a lot of times I don't really come up with a good answer because sometimes initially I'll have an answer for that question and I'll picture a character a certain way as a certain actor, but then as I get to know that character more deeply, they just become so much of their own person that that actor doesn't seem quite right anymore. So yeah, I mean, sometimes I think more likely the side characters, I have an idea of who they might be played by, but my main characters, I generally I have no idea. Question number 6, have you ever stared at a stranger because they look like one of your characters? I think I kind of vaguely recall this maybe happening once, but honestly, a lot of times my characters, like the main ones, I don't have a 100% clear picture of what they look like. Like, it's kind of one of those things, especially Jacob. It's like, he's clear in my head until I try to think about it, if that makes sense. Like, I'm reading along and writing and I'm picturing him, and then I try to like picture him in my head and like describe what he looks like, and it's just gone, and I can't picture him anymore at all. So it's not really someone, I don't think it's something that I would like see someone in person and be like, oh my gosh, you look like my character, because they're not really that clear in my head, I guess. But there is kind of a fun story about this. I was writing a Lexana fan fiction, which is Lex Luthor and Lana Lang from Smallville. And I went to the mall to write, and as I was walking in front of me, there was this couple walking together, holding hands, and he was bald and she had like long brown hair and was kind of short, and they just looked exactly like Lex Luthor and Lana Lang, and it was the cutest thing ever. And not only did I stare at them, I took a picture of them and drew a little heart around them and put it on the internet. Question number 7, do you talk to yourself to help you work through your scenes? And if so, where do you talk to yourself? Yes, and everywhere. Like literally everywhere. And sometimes I just forget that other people exist and might be looking at me weirdly, and I don't think about it at all. I absolutely talk to myself mostly at work, which is awkward because sometimes clients come home and I didn't realize they came home, and so I'm just off in my little corner vacuuming and talking full volume. This literally happened once. I had a client who would often like kind of go out and run errands, and then he'd come home and just be in and out. And I was vacuuming his hallway, and I was talking to myself like I'm talking right now, just this volume, completely talking openly. And at that time I was writing Keep No Record, which a lot of that book is about like murder and being a little bit crazy. And anyway, I was talking full volume, and I turn around and my client is sitting right there at the dining room table on his laptop doing some work, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's absolutely no way he didn't just hear me talking to myself insanely loudly like a crazy person. So that happened. But yeah, I do. I talk to myself all the time, everywhere, and it's not even like, sometimes it's something I just don't even notice I'm doing, and I have a hard time actually stopping myself from doing it. So it can be awkward sometimes. Question number 8. While writing, do you make the facial expressions your characters are making? Abso-freaking-lutely I do. And not only do I do it when I'm writing, I also do it when I'm talking to myself or when I'm thinking about writing. All the time, like literally everywhere I go. If I'm like off in my own head for a minute, I'm probably thinking about some story, and I start mouthing the words and making the facial expressions immediately, and I don't even realize I'm doing it. And then when I do realize, I'm like super embarrassed, like, oh my gosh, I hope people weren't looking at me just now because I just looked like a crazy person. But yeah, I do that all the time, and that was really difficult when I used to write primarily in public. I had to kind of stop myself from doing that, which really does kind of hinder my writing, actually. And same thing like when I'm writing at home and I'm vlogging, so I'm like filming myself typing, I feel like I'm being watched, and it makes it harder to get my head into the zone because I want to make the facial expressions and talk to myself and stuff, and I just feel awkward because I know I'm being watched. And yeah, so I almost need to make the facial expressions. It's not even just something I do. It's like if I don't do it, it's really hard for me to get in the head of the characters. Also, sometimes in order to put words to a certain facial expression, you just have to make the face. You know, you have to scrunch up your face to think about like what am I doing right now? If I'm looking frustrated or skeptical or sad or suspicious or whatever, like what do I do with my face? And the best way to do that is to make the face and then describe it. It's yeah, I don't see how people don't do that when they're writing. Y'all are the real weird ones, anyone who doesn't do that. Question number 9, do you ever practice answering interview questions for when you make it big? Elliot, you're calling me out, girl. I absolutely do this all the time. But the thing is, I don't really watch or listen to any kind of like interviews of authors. So the people that I picture interviewing me, that I'm like, ooh, if I was famous, like I'd want to be on this show or talk to this person, none of those people are going, even if I was a famous author, like I'm never going to be on that show because they don't interview authors. They interview like actors and stuff. And I'm not that. So either way, it's just never going to happen, but I still think about it all the time. The number one person I would just die to be interviewed by is Michael Rosenbaum. He played Lex Luthor in Smallville, and he does a podcast now called Inside of You, where he gets inside of various celebrities. And I guess not all of the people he talks to are actors. Some of them are like writers of movies or shows or producers or whatever, but they pretty much all are involved in the filmmaking process in some way. So I'm not a person, even if I was really famous, who is ever gonna be on Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, but it doesn't stop me from daydreaming about how amazing it would be. And finally, question number 10, do you have a soundtrack and or playlist for your book or scenes from your book? I don't have like an official soundtrack or playlist or whatever, but I do have some songs definitely that go along with my book. For Keep No Record, most of those are obvious because they're actually written into the books. The book. Like at one point, Jacob and Sarah are kind of playfully singing along to Time After Time by Cyndi Lauper, so that's definitely a song that makes me think of my book. Another one is I Got You Under My Skin by Frank Sinatra. Wow, I had a hard time saying that. That was a struggle. That song is directly mentioned in my book, so that's another one. The only one I would say that's not already mentioned is there's a scene where Sarah I'm trying not to get too spoilery here, but she wakes up in the farmhouse and she hears music playing on an old record, and it's kind of like, it's described as like a beautiful song that would be really pretty in a normal context, but in the context she's in, it feels sinister. So that song I always picture being Shaboom Shaboom, and I can't remember, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't remember who does that song, but it's in the movie. The first time I ever heard that song was in the movie Clue, I think, the old one with Tim Curry, and it's just like, it's pretty, but it kind of has like a little bit of a sinister feel to it in that movie, and so that's just the song that I picture playing during that scene. And then in my new book, Broken Together, there are a few songs that kind of go along with that story. Number one is the song Broken Together by Casting Crowns, which is why I named the book that. I was looking through the Bible to try to find a cool verse that kind of summed up my book, or like had something to do with it, because that's how I named my first book. I named Keep No Record after the Bible verse, love keeps no record of wrongs. And I liked that theme, and I wanted to carry it over to the second book as well, since they're tied together. But I just didn't really find a verse that felt right to me. So I instead was looking at some Christian songs, and I flipped over my Casting Crowns CD that was sitting next to me, and there's a song on that CD called Broken Together, and it is so beautiful. You should listen to it if you haven't heard it. It's basically kind of about like a struggling marriage and a couple who's struggling together, and there's a part that says, maybe you and I were never meant to be complete. Could we just be broken together? And I adore that quote. It is such a perfect embodiment of what my book is about. I really wanted to put it at the beginning of the book, like the quote, but I learned that you can't just do that. You have to actually like have permission to use a quote like that in a book, and I don't. So I couldn't do that, but I did decide to name the book Broken Together because it just like, it's just perfect. And then another one is, there's a scene which I'm not going to say much about because it is very late on in the story, but there's a scene where a girl plays a song that she wrote, and it's described as romantic but sad at the same time. And that song, I always picture, oh, what is it called? Let's see. Careful by Michelle Featherstone. That song is the song I picture her playing during that scene. Sort of. It's not quite right. The lyrics don't quite fit with the story, but it's just the feel of it. And then there's also a scene also late on in the book where two characters are singing karaoke, and they're singing Baby It's Cold Outside. So that's also another song that just makes me think of my book. So yeah. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it and you want to do it, do it. I'm not going to tag anybody specific, but if you're interested, go for it, friend. Anyway, I will see you guys next time, and have a great day. Bye.